Starting immediately from my left in the order that they will speak, Richard Heydarian, who is of De La Salle University, but currently at National Chengchi University in Taiwan, has just completed a new book, and he'll touch a bit on that. He's one of the foremost authorities on Southeast Asia and the Philippines, and particularly the Philippine-China relationship. Dhruva Jaishankar, to his left, has just returned to Washington to become the head of the U.S. effort of the Observer Research Foundation. I first met him almost now 30 years ago, I think, in Japan when you were there. And so delighted to see how you've developed into an absolute first-class institute leader, but also a scholar and analyst on the region. And I've met today Lizalette Odegaard, who's a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. And what's terrific about having Professor Odegaard here is her work, as I was doing the background work, is really picks up the US, China, and Europe thread. And I think it's particularly more salient as we look at post-Brexit UK and we look at the role of France and other European states in the Indo-Pacific. And look forward to hearing from her. And of course, our chair and leader of this effort, Satoru Nagao. So, format is very simple. Three of our presenters have a PowerPoint presentation. They'll make their case, and then we'll go one rep through the other, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. And each of them will speak for an allotted amount of time. I'll try to catch their attention to keep them on schedule so that we can give maximum time to you to ask questions and make comments from the floor. With that, again, thank you for joining us. And Richard, may I invite you, please? Yes. And he's very high tech, so he has a phone keeping track of his time.
Trying to behave myself. Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure. I hope I'm my usual energetic version. I'm still halfway into a 5 or 6 country speaking tour right now. It's a pleasure to be here in Hudson Institute. It's one of the places I love because I feel I don't need to be very politically correct when it comes to discussions of China. My experience in speaking across the region is that I have to be always much more careful about my language, like sometimes you use assertiveness rather than aggression, among others. Here I feel I can be a little bit more free-flowing and a bit more myself, right? And you can imagine why I'm not very popular among some friends in Southeast Asia. I'm also very indebted to Hudson Institute and, of course, Satoru-san, because I just finished a book on Indo-Pacific. I think it's the first book on Indo-Pacific. It's around 400 pages based on 10 years of writing and experience across the Indo-Pacific. My dad comes from the Caspian region. My mom comes from Southeast Asia with some Iberian background. So more or less ethnically, I cover much of Indo-Pacific. And I've written books and written a lot about across the region. So I tried to bring them together under the ambit of US-China competition, particularly under the Trump administration, and how we're going to move forward. So we gave a presentation last year on Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia's place in that, and that presentation we had here in Hudson really helped me to put the final touches to the book. So today I'm going to talk about what I call China's premature bid for hegemony. Again, the more politically correct term was China's inchoate hegemony. I've written for a number of think tanks on this issue, but I think premature hegemony pretty much puts it where I need it to be put. Now, I think the question also right now is how do we preserve peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific? And this is not about confronting China per se or excluding China, but how to make sure that we manage the rise of China in ways that is mutually acceptable and mutually beneficial. Now, so this is the book. Sorry, it was too fresh, so I couldn't bring copies. Maybe early next year I can come back for a proper book tour on that. Now, when it comes to understanding what's happening in the Pacific, particularly in the Asia Pacific, I think there are two figures that help me a lot to frame the question and possible answer. One is, of course, the late Singaporean leader, Lee Kuan Yew. He was not right on everything, but I think he got China very much right. And he was the bridge between the West and the East, especially when it comes to engagement with China. And the other one is, of course, one of my favorite philosophers, Walter Benjamin. These are the two quotes that I think are very important for us to keep in mind. You know, one of the observations that Lee Kuan Yew made, which made a huge impression on me, was that the rise of China, especially for us in Southeast Asia, in the peripheries of China, is so dramatic that it's not going to only require tactical balance of power adjustment. It's going to change the system itself because of the sheer size and influence and ambition of China. And we feel that very much in Southeast Asia, that this is not just another rising power that we have to do some power balancing, that this is going to change the rules of the game. And we're beginning to feel that right now as we enter what we can call a strategic interregnum in East Asia. On the other hand, Walter Benjamin also talked about how behind every fascism, there's a failed revolution. Now, I'm not saying that China is a fascist, but what I'm trying to say here is that I think the confrontation and the tensions that we see today in East Asia is also very much a product of our inability to create a Kantian perpetual peace through strong institutions that will preserve pacifist and dialogue-based interaction. And this is where, coming from Southeast Asia, I'm also slightly critical of ASEAN, and I feel in the ASEAN we could do a much better job in ensuring that we negotiate great power relationship with much more proactiveness and the willingness to take a little bit more risk, which we're not doing. Now, to defend the ASEAN, because I tend to get misunderstood on this issue, is that in fairness to the ASEAN, it has achieved a lot. I mean, if you're familiar with Southeast Asian geopolitics, in the 1960s, for instance, confrontation was the name of the game. War among a number of archipelagic and core countries of ASEAN was almost inevitable in the eyes of some people. I remember going through the WikiLeaks cable, and in one of the cable, I saw something very interesting, that Razak Senior administration in Malaysia asked its foreign minister to talk to Britain, for Britain to talk to Kissinger, for Kissinger to talk to Nixon, for Nixon to talk to Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines back then, not to invade Malaysia over the Sabah issue. So in the late 1960s, the question of war among Southeast Asian countries was very much in the air. Now, 50 years forward, the notion of war, or even the threat of use of war among Southeast Asian countries, is almost unthinkable. And I think that's a huge achievement in itself. We have established what constructivists would call a kind of a security community among ourselves, whereby even the threat of use of war, despite impending and lingering territorial disputes, is unthinkable. So it's not that we're short of conflicts and tensions, but we're definitely not short of ways to manage dispute among ourselves. If you look at the ASEAN, it was also able to finalize a free trade agreement way ahead of the time of schedule, the AFTA CAPT, bringing down tariff rates to zero. And it made us so ambitious that we thought we can create an economic community by 2015, but of course, we missed the mark. But nonetheless, we move also forward quite quickly on that issue. ASEAN countries also have been effective in terms of pushing for non-traditional security cooperation, whether anti-piracy, counterterrorism, and most recently, after the ISIS siege in Marawi in southern Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have also been doing coordinated trilateral maritime patrols to ensure that ISIS elements will not enter, especially southern Philippines area. And then we are having also more intelligence sharing and cooperation among countries. So a lot of achievements have happened here, but I think above all, what ASEAN has to offer is convening power, the ability to bring big powers together, including sometimes North Korea, if you look at the ASEAN Regional Forum discussions, so that they can talk. And as Winston Churchill said, better jaw than war, right? So I think this is where ASEAN is very important. And as someone who spent some time in the Middle East, I could say that I really prefer what we have in Southeast Asia than the Game of Thrones situation they have in there. I think even Game of Thrones doesn't capture what's happening down there in the Persian Gulf. Nonetheless, as the playwright Arthur Miller said, an era can be considered over when its basic illusions have been exhausted. I think the illusions here is that the ASEAN, the effectiveness that we had in creating a security community among ourselves, smaller countries, will also be able to be as effective in terms of socializing other great powers to internalize our principles of how to deal with our problems and interstate tensions. The reality, though, is that the ASEAN, I think, has a fundamental misunderstanding of some of its own key principles. So the two key principles are mushawara and muwafaqat, consultation and consensus. But in the ASEAN, our understanding of consensus is actually unanimity, right? If you look at it particularly on questions of security, politics, and human rights. And unanimity is a very problematic way of understanding it because unanimity means every country effectively has a veto power, right? And B, if you're an external power who doesn't want ASEAN to be united on an issue, whether you're China, US, or whatnot, all you need to do is to exert pressure and lean on one of members of the ASEAN, regardless of the degree of concern of that ASEAN country in order to sabotage ASEAN unity on this issue. So let's say Cambodia or Laos are countries who have no direct interest in the South China Sea. And I don't blame them if they're sometimes, seen as saboteurs, because from their point of view, why should we risk, pissing off the Chinese, who are a major source of investments and, of course, diplomatic support, when in fact we have nothing to do in South China Sea disputes. I remember very well Prime Minister Hun Sen in 2015, right before the Philippine Arbitration Award against China came out at The Hague. He said, this is a political issue. We don't want to do anything about it. So this is a problem whereby you don't have weighted majority voting as in the European Council. You don't have majority voting. You have essentially unanimity-based decision-making. And in this situation, you're essentially asking for trouble. So my term for that is what I call middle institutional trap. It's like a middle income trap, or in more layman terms, a middle age trap. So the kind of decision-making process that allowed the ASEAN to create peace among ourselves over the past 50 years is no longer effective in terms of creating peace among major powers. And that is also today affecting us very much. And this is very much related to the Indo-Pacific discussion. Now, and this is where ASEAN is also increasingly moving from centrality to peripherality. Now, the reality is that while the ASEAN is struggling with asserting its centrality, China is changing the facts on the ground. Let's be very clear about that. So over the past 2 or 3 years, China has deployed surface-to-air missiles. Admiral Davidson calls this the Great Wall of SAMs, not only SANS, but also SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, electronic jamming equipment, nuclear-capable bombers. The Chinese Coast Guard now is essentially the extension of the PLA Navy. We see more and more maritime militia forces from China pushing the envelope and engaging in aggressive action against countries across the region. So the level of diplomatic dynamism of ASEAN is not catching up with the facts on the ground. And one of my frustration is while we're talking about the code of conduct with China, China is changing facts on the ground on a daily basis. So while we're wasting our time in negotiations, which by the way, we're not even sure it's going to be legally binding, we're not even going to be sure if it's going to be legally binding, whose law, whose interpretation of international law, facts on the ground are changing. Nonetheless, my message here is one of cautious optimism. My message is that there are at least 3 reasons to be skeptical about this whole conventional wisdom that Asia is gone, China's already won it. I come from the Philippines. One of our icons is Manny Pacman. And if I'm going to use boxing as a kind of metaphor, I think we're just in round 4. And I think this is going to go all the way to round 12, if not more. Why? The first reason is I think America's power and the resilience of its power and influence in Asia has been underestimated. If we look at actually much more observant analysis of America's power, for instance, I think Michael Beckley has done a good job in a journal article on international security, and his latest book, he talks about, for instance, net power. A lot of people mistakenly think China is taking over because their GDP size is so large, but the country's power is not just the gross size of your economy. It's your net power, it's your ecological resources, it's your human capital, it's the living standard of your people, how much power you can deploy, the technology you have at your disposal. And the reality is that if you look at the data over the past 20 years, you're not seeing actually much convergence between China and the United States. And by the way, US has to grow only 3 or 4% to match China's 7, 8, 9, 10% growth because the base of American economy is much larger. If you look at biotechnology, if you look at cutting-edge technology, US is still way ahead. Now, there was a very interesting observation by people, including Farid Zakaria, that everyone is panicking about China creating 1 million scientists per year. But the question is the quality of scientists. A lot of these people have just vocational training. Yes, China has a lot of ISI publications, but what is their citation rate? And quality very much matters when you talk about net power and competition. Now, this is very interesting. People were asked across Asia Pacific, who do you still prefer to be the world leader? US still comes on top, despite the fact that there have been some doubts about the Trump administration, the unpredictability of the new American president. Still, the US is someone that a lot of countries in the region trust to be the leader. And for more cynical people, it's the devil we know. That's the perspective that they have. Now, interestingly, when this is a survey by ICS, Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, people were asked about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, majority were skeptical about this. So while formally speaking, leaders in Southeast Asia welcome China's investment, well, with the exception perhaps of Prime Minister Mahathir, and we'll talk about that later on, the reality is that behind the scenes, there's a lot of skepticism among experts, government officials, and of course, people on the ground. The other thing is, we also have to put things into context. There's a lot of criticism about President Trump supposedly, ditching the TPP, weakening American position in this part of the world. But for a lot of countries, I'm based partly in Taiwan, based also partly in the Philippines, for actually a lot of countries on the front line of China's assertiveness or aggression, however you want to put it, the US is actually even more reliable right now than the Obama administration. For instance, if you look at the freedom of navigation operation, they're much more regular, much more expansive. They're extending to areas like the Scarborough Shoal. US sometimes use double warships. US is using more advanced warships and littoral combat ships. You're seeing more pushback. Now, despite some diplomatic tensions between countries like Philippines and the United States over the past 3 years under President Duterte, China-leaning President Duterte, actually the foreign military financing from the US has increased, more than doubled to the Philippines. Again, despite the tensions, for instance, between Philippines and US, this year alone, there were 290 joint military activities between United States and the Philippines, more than any Indo-Pacific country, more than any time in the history of Philippine-US military cooperation since the Second World War. More interestingly, you also see more presence by the US Coast Guard. We were just in Halifax Forum with Dhruva the other day, and I got to catch up with Admiral Schultz, who's the head of the US Coast Guard. And since last year, we have to acknowledge that the US Coast Guard is doing a great job of doing their own version of FONOPS in the Taiwan Strait, doing more joint exercises with regional Coast Guard commands, and helping capacity building among countries in Southeast Asia. These are very important things. But the second thing I have to emphasize here is that everyone talks about, oh, well, we have a dichotomy whereby China dominates economy and US dominates security. It's actually way more complicated than that. Let's look at, for instance, the frontier of geopolitical competition, which is infrastructure development. If you look at infrastructure development, especially in Southeast Asia, China is not the one leading, it's actually Japan. If you look at data, and this is where I always make this comment, China, although they're communists supposedly, they get more bang out of imaginary bucks sometimes. They're better salesmen than any of other democratic countries in this part of the world. So this is an interesting data by Fitch Solutions that came out, and Bloomberg made a very interesting report on that. If you look at Southeast Asia, actually Japan has more infrastructure development projects. That's on top of the fact that Japan has already been the leading source of infrastructure development and overseas development assistance in Southeast Asia. I think a lot of us are underestimating the predominance, the economic predominance of Japan in East Asia, although, of course, in terms of trade and investment flows, China has been taking over the past 15 years. And more importantly, if you look at key countries in Southeast Asia and countries who have disputes with China in the South China Sea, like Vietnam and like the Philippines, by far, Japan is a top investor in infrastructure. In the Philippines, for instance, out of the 10 big-ticket infrastructure projects of China, not a single one has cleared the preliminary phases. One or two has done the Kaliwa and the Chico River Dam project, but I'm not sure $60 million is considered a big-ticket project. And more than that, a lot of these projects could have immensely negative ecological impact on indigenous peoples and communities in the area. So even though there is some project and it's not really big-ticket, it could be actually much more problematic, and it's much more than a question of debt trap. If you look at Vietnam, it's fascinating that Japan is way ahead of China in terms of overall investment. So you have 74 projects by Japan in Vietnam versus 24 by Japan. And if you look at who is the rising power in Southeast Asia, without question, that is Vietnam. And Vietnam will be the ASEAN chairman next year. And they're now essentially leading the region, or at least sometimes leading the lone fight in terms of drawing the line in South China Sea. So here again, you see clearly in Vietnam and in the Philippines, Japan is well ahead in terms of infrastructure development. But it's not only them, it's also India. I mean, Dhruva will talk about this, so I'm not going to go deep into it, and he has interesting tweets about this issue. I think the role of India and also Australia in terms of capacity building in the region is underestimated. If you look at the efforts of Quad countries in terms of providing alternative avenues for raising infrastructure capital for development projects in Southeast Asia. If you look at, for instance, Australia helping the Philippines in counterterrorism and dealing with the ISIS threats, there are a lot of things which are happening which are not appreciated enough, and I'll leave that to our experts here on the ground. But the third thing is this. I think a lot of people underestimate the struggle for autonomy and strategic astuteness of smaller countries in Southeast Asia. In fact, I'll take an issue with the word small. Indonesia is 270 million people last time I checked. It's almost American size in terms of demographics. And in terms of GDP, Indonesia is expected to be among the top 5 biggest economies in the world in the next 2 decades, and probably even number 3 or 4 before the end of this century. It's a huge country. At some point, Indonesia may be so big that it will outgrow ASEAN. But Indonesia is not the only big country. Philippines is more than 100 million, Vietnam is more than 100 million, and these countries are going to be trillion-dollar GDPs in the very much near to medium future. So ASEAN is not really a collection of small countries. It's really a collection of highly dynamic middle powers who could be a force on their own terms, right? Although they're going through difficult times. And if you look at countries in Southeast Asia, plus Taiwan also, of course, where they're very much at the front line, you see actually leaders of this country very astutely, engaging China, but at the same time trying to preserve some room for maneuver. Case in point is Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. I interviewed him earlier this year. He's 94, and he's going to turn 95 soon. Very lucid. He's very much on the top of his portfolio. He took the fight to China on the Belt and Road issue, on the debt trap issue, and eventually he managed to get $6 billion, if I'm not mistaken, of renegotiation of the contracts with them. Now, on other issues, Vietnam is pushing for a legally binding code of conduct and pushing for more pushback against China in the South China Sea, or in the case of Taiwan, for instance, they're very much aggressively highlighting sharp power operations, which is a completely different topic. But if you want to learn about China's sharp power operations, influence operations, I think the Taiwanese are the best people to talk to. But in fairness to them, they have been pushing back, and they've been quite successful in that. And most likely, Tsai Ing-wen is going to pull off her re-election. Now, I'm almost done, 90th minute. The thing is this, what is the way forward? I think the way forward is very clear. First of all, you have to make sure that the whole discussion of the Indo-Pacific is not a euphemism for saying ASEAN is no longer relevant. That is why the ASEAN earlier this year had to come up with its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific to ensure that it still has a space there. The ASEAN point of view, I think this is the average mean point of view in ASEAN, is that we have to be aware of threats from China, but at the same time, we have to recognize that China is a player, and China is, whether we like it or not, part of the game. And engagement with China is inevitable. But the question is, how do we engage them in ways that make China more responsive to the needs and sensitivities of smaller countries? As for Quad countries, rather than talking about creating a counter-coalition or counter-alliance against China, I think it's much more important to focus on capacity building and strengthening smaller countries' ability to actually defend themselves. I think that's the best way in order to deal with the threats that is emerging from China. But at the same time, it's important that America and its key allies have more strategic presence in this part of the world. And lastly, I think in the ASEAN, as much as we want to talk about multilateralism, the reality is that the consensus-based decision-making process is essentially a unanimity-based decision-making process. So I think the best way to serve multilateralism, the best way to make ASEAN more effective is actually minilateralism. Engagement among key countries in ASEAN, and engagement of Quad countries with key countries within the ASEAN. And we're talking about Indonesia, we're talking about Philippines, we're talking about Vietnam, Malaysia, and these countries. If the Quad countries can have effective and institutionalized cooperation with these countries on issues whereby we have concerns with China, I think that's more than enough. You don't need to get all 10 ASEAN countries on board. And I think through minilateralism, you can eventually make ASEAN much more relevant. It's a very controversial issue, but I'll leave it there to the question and answer. So I'm 1 minute over time. Thank you very much.